All right, so we're going to talk about this next group of organs. And these are organs where food doesn't actually travel through. So we know that if we go back up, the mouth, the esophagus, the stomach, the duodenum, the small intestine, large intestine, rectum, and anus. The food is all traveling through those organs. But there's some other organs up here. Food doesn't go through them, but they're super helpful in digestion. And those are the ones we're going to talk about. The first one we have here is the liver. So this is our liver. And our liver is important because, as you can see, with this little tube, it's connected to our small intestine. So it's going to be delivering some stuff to our small intestine that's super important. Remember, that first part of the small intestine is called the duodenum. And this is where most of our digestion is happening. So our liver, what does it do? Our liver produces something called bile. And bile is sent to our small intestines. So we're going to talk about what bile is in a second. So bile, let's take a look. Bile does something that's called emulsification. It's a fancy schmancy word. It happens when we have fats and liquids together. If you've ever opened your refrigerator door and you see some liquid and some fats, maybe in like a salad dressing, and it's separated, usually you shake it up. And what happens when you shake it up? Well, when we shake it up, we end up getting all of these little tiny droplets. If I were to zoom in on this picture, what you'd be able to see is that there's little tiny droplets of fats and liquid in here. And that's called emulsification, turning this big bunch of fat into little tiny droplets that are kind of like dissolved, but not really. Here's another picture. Big bunch of fat. Bile helps coat the outside. And when it coats the outside, it allows the little molecules to separate from each other. And that's called emulsion. It has to do with the positive and negative charges on bile and the fat, and we're not going to get into that. But basically, bile coats the outside of fat and allows it to form little tiny droplets, whereas normally it likes to stick together. So we already wrote this top thing here. We're going to write down that bile emulsifies fats, which means it makes it into smaller droplets. We've talked about surface area before. I'm going to go back just for a second. In the villi, when we're absorbing stuff, right? The villi are those little finger-like projections. Those increase surface area. Here, we're increasing surface area. If you are an enzyme or something that's going to help break down this fat, it's a lot easier to get to this fat and break it down if you can come from all different sides of this little fat molecule than just coming at this big fat globule. So bile helps emulsify fats. It helps make it into smaller droplets. And then the liver also helps store us carbohydrates for later. So we know that complex carbs, carbohydrates with lots of hexagons, lots of glucose connected together, can be stored. Just like in plants, they store them in the root, in the cortex, we can store them in the liver. So we store them as glycogen. It's just a fancy molecule that's a whole bunch of hexagons together. It's very similar to starch. So from the liver then, we're going to look at this little green organ here underneath the liver. So liver makes bile, and now we need somewhere to store it. So it's going to be making bile, and it's going to store it in this gallbladder, which is underneath the liver. You might have heard of gallstones. That's a common problem that can happen with the gallbladder. So this is just for storing. So it stores it until it's ready to go to the small intestine. And we're going to look then, this little tube here is our bile duct. So this tube going into the intestines is our bile duct. And the bile duct is just a pathway. So you can see here's our big liver, our gallbladder, and there's just a little tube. It's going to empty in to our duodenum, our first part of our small intestine, and that's where it's going to help us break apart those fats so that they can be digested easier. We haven't talked about an enzyme that digests fats yet. We talked about the bile that helps separate it. We haven't really talked about an enzyme that digests fats. We'll talk about that a little bit later in this unit. But we also have this guy underneath the stomach. This is the pancreas. And the pancreas makes a lot of enzymes. Really, really powerful ones. So it too is going to send its enzymes to the small intestine, the duodenum, where it's going to help digest stuff. You may also know that the pancreas is what's producing insulin. Insulin's what we need in order to allow sugar into our cells. We talked about when those receptors don't work properly. Remember, insulin's the little key that unlocks the little channel so that sugar can go into the cells. So in diabetes, that lock and key doesn't work properly and insulin can't get into the cells. So somebody with type 1 diabetes doesn't produce insulin, or somebody with a type 2 diabetes, their insulin doesn't work properly or their cells don't work properly. So again, if we're making enzymes, we got to get them to the small intestine where the food is, and that's why we have this little duct here. Again, it's just a little itty bitty tiny passageway from the pancreas to go into the duodenum. So tube from the small intestine to the pancreas.